This is Ms. Waetzig.
Yes.
Waetzig.
Yeah, you got it right.
I told her I was going to really screw up her name, and out of respect for her, I was just so nervous about saying her name. So we're really, really happy that she could be here today. She has a ton of expertise in the area of organizational change and working with child serving systems and other organizations to help sustain, support, and sustain change. And part of that experience is her expertise around leading through conflict. So without any, I'm sure that you don't want to be hearing me, so I'll hand it over, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. What a beautiful part of the state. It's just gorgeous. I've never been to State College before, and I was driving here, and I was just in awe. It's beautiful here, and some of the nicest people I've met in anywhere in the country that I've traveled, which is a lot of places, I have to say. So please take that as a compliment. It's been very welcoming and great to be here. Does it sound like my mic is on?
No, but you're good.
I'm okay?
Yeah.
Do you want, but for your purposes, does it need to be on?
Yeah, I'm good.
You can hear me okay? Okay, perfect. All right, for those of you in the back, you can sit at the back at your own peril, because I don't know if my voice will travel that far without the mic. So anytime you choose to move up, we will welcome you up to these tables up here. If you choose to stay back there, that's absolutely okay. So I just want to tell you a little bit about my background and a little bit about this particular love of mine, and then we'll get started. So I actually was trained as a lawyer, which means I spent 3 years studying what conflict was about and what my role in beating other people would look like. And I spent some time actually doing that work in the child welfare and juvenile delinquency systems in a couple of different states. And I sort of felt after just a couple years that it didn't make sense, that the court system as it was in the early 90s was not a great place to solve our complex challenges for children, youth, and families. And I felt really limited by the options that I felt were available to me in support of these folks that the law provided. So I went and was trained as a mediator in the early 90s. And I remember the first night after training, I called home and I said, I found my calling. I love this. I love the fact that I can sit with people who are really in disagreement, they're struggling to move forward, and I can help them hold a conversation, and I don't have to be responsible for the outcome. It was great. There's nothing worse than sitting and defending a mom who's in a termination of parental rights case and feeling the weight of that responsibility as she's sitting next to me and sobbing. I hated that. It was so hard, and I felt such compassion for her. But in mediation, when I have that same mom and the child welfare caseworker and sometimes the young person and maybe some of the other resources, we can have a conversation where they all engage and figure out how to move forward, and they own that outcome. And I just loved that. So after I became trained as a mediator, I met Dr. Phyllis McGrath, who some of you may know is the director of the Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development. And it was right around the time that IDEA was reauthorized and required that mediation be available to families and the system in special ed. And she really was the only person at Georgetown, but because she was the director, she could make these decisions. She said, we have to have some capacity at this center, at this technical assistance center, around collaborative decision making and mediation and all of these ways of engaging people in making decisions, solving problems, moving forward. And so my real training and education came at Georgetown on the sort of in the field. And in fact, Wendy Luckenbill was in the first group of family members that we offered training to at the Georgetown Institutes, I believe in 1996. So it's been and it was called Negotiating Together, and I'll just tell you this little story. Wendy was not engaged in this little group of family members who decided after the first day that they were going to mutiny and they were going to leave. It was a 2-day training, and it was my first training ever, and I was devastated. And so Phyllis, in her wisdom, said, let's try to understand what the issue is. And so what they told her is, we didn't think you were going to try to help us get along. We thought you were going to try to help, or you were going to help us learn how to carry a briefcase and a yellow legal pad and get our way in negotiation. Now this was in 1996, so it was a way different climate. See how far we've come in almost 20 years? We completely think differently about advocacy and negotiation and collaboration than we did back then. And so I'm happy to say that that first training led to a whole bunch of other stuff, including leading through conflict, which I'm here to talk about today. And leading through conflict, just to warn you, is a 3-day training. So, and we're here for an hour and 20 minutes left. So please understand that I picked, I think, a couple of concepts from this training that I think not only are sort of give you the highlights, but also might be useful to you. Because I certainly don't want you to leave here with a couple of good thoughts. I'd like you to leave here with a couple of good ideas. So this is what I think we're going to do today. Oh, come on, this is supposed to work. All right, so this is what I think the objectives are today. And by the way, the more that we can make this a conversation, the more you'll get out of it. So I am absolutely happy at any time for you to stop me and say, but what about? Or I've had this, I can't diagnose your experience right here, but you can say, I've had this experience with conflict and it resonates with me. So anytime you want to chime in, ask a question, add to the conversation, please, I totally welcome that. It will make it even more applicable for you. So what we're going to do is develop some shared understanding of these 3 concepts: collaboration, leadership, and conflict. The leadership and conflict sort of makes sense given the title, Leading Through Conflict, but we lead through conflict in the context of collaboration. Collaboration to address, as I said this morning, for those of you who were in the system providers session, is about addressing complex challenges. The challenges we face in our communities are not simple. They're not even complicated, they're complex. And I think your Deputy Secretary who spoke this morning talked about the fact, or someone did, talked about the fact that it looks different in every single county. There's no formula for this. These are complex, big questions and challenges. And conflict definitely shows up because we ask for diverse people to be here. So we want to develop a little shared understanding of these 3 concepts. We also want to talk about a structure. We'll talk about it briefly, but there's a structure for engaging conflict as a leader. And the 2 specific questions are, who is the situation calling me to be? Who do I choose to be as a leader in conflict? And what is the situation calling me to do? So there's always a split. Who am I choosing to be? And what do I need to do as a result of that choice? And then lastly, what are some of and we have a whole matrix, I'll share it with you in a moment, of different roles leaders can play across different phases of a conflict engagement process. So what are the considerations for all of those 3 roles in all of those 3 phases? And it's very tiny print. Those of you who need glasses will need your glasses when you look at this. But it's a pretty detailed explanation of this model, and I'll hand that out in a little bit. So just let me pause here for a moment. Did anybody have any different objectives or additional objectives that when you were reading over the list of possibilities for this afternoon and you zeroed in on this one and decided to come, was there something that anybody was hoping to get out of it that they'd like to share at this point? I know we don't have time to go all around the whole room and ask everybody, but.
Just to be able to figure out how to listen to everybody's very opinionated ideas.
Yeah. To create a space where everybody gets to have it. It's hard. Yeah, it's hard. Absolutely. You nailed it. It's hard. And you can do it. What else? Yeah.
Sometimes some of the stakeholders, maybe families, can be very irrational about issues and treatment, and it becomes very complicated because kind of splinters the group, and it definitely affects the treatment of the adult child or the child or however age that child might be. And you never really seem to be able to master that. And we see patterns of that through the years, and they are probably the most difficult.
So certainly we notice that when lots of different people come to the table, there are lots of different ideas and experiences and knowledge and maybe opinions about what should happen. And the more emotional and challenging the situation, the more difficult it is to maintain our sense of calm, rational thought for all of us. And I mean, family members, providers, system administrators, when we get emotionally attached to the way things are going, we all have a sense. I mean, we all have biology when it comes to conflict. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We all have biological reactions. In addition to emotional reactions. And so being able to identify those and work through them is part of leading through conflict and making sure that everybody has a space at that table. Everybody needs to be there. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's so much a space at the table, but I can speak as a family, because I am a family member. In the beginning, until I learned how the system worked, what each agency did, how they were supposed to all come together, I could be very confrontational at meetings because everyone sitting at the table knew how their specific system worked. When I first came into the system, I had a little bit of knowledge about education, but when it came to the mental health side of it, I had absolutely no knowledge, and nobody took the time to sit down and explain to me. And you know what I learned a long time ago? The squeaky wheel gets a grease. So if I'd have been one of your parents at your meetings, let me tell you what, I learned that I don't bother with you. I go to the top dog, and that's when you get things done.
Okay. So it sounds like there's some real feelings around conflict in this room, and there's some history. There's some history. And you know what? There is in every system in every state across the country. I just came from another state last week who has a historic, embedded, entrenched, and somewhat intractable conflict between their family organization and their providers in their state. There's 3 different entities there. And there are historic embedded relationships. And the conflict shows up not sometimes because of the 2 people disagreeing, but sometimes because of the relationship that they came in the door with. And so part of leading through conflict is understanding how that conflict shows up and how it shows up between the people at the table, and what you as a leader how you choose to be and what you choose to do in the face of conflict when it shows up. And so I'm going to offer you a little bit of an approach to think about as you come to this table. Okay? Anybody else have any expectations or hopes before we move on? Okay, so let's just set the stage with collaboration. Again, for some of you who were there for the half hour that I spoke this morning, some of this may be a little bit familiar, but we do have to set the context. We're doing this within the context of collaboration. So what does that mean? Why do we collaborate? Well, one of the reasons we collaborate is because they make us, right? We filled out a grant proposal. They have required partners. We have other partners that are optional, but it is an expectation and a requirement of the work that we do. I don't like that I have to be in front of this computer when I click this thing. The next thing is that we know is that this work is complex and it can't be done by any one of us. If we're creating coordinated, comprehensive systems of care to achieve optimal health for children, youth, and families, there is no one agency or entity that can do it by themselves. Otherwise, it would have been done, right? Okay. We believe, and we talked about this a lot this morning, we believe that there's mutual gain or mutual benefit when we come together. Now, we got to mutual purpose. We're all here for kids and families. What I haven't seen a lot of groups get to is the mutual gain or benefit. And so I'm going to make the challenge here that I made this morning. Go back to your collaborative group and ask everybody around the table to say, why did I spend the last hour here? What did I get out of it? If I got here and I gave a few updates and I got a few updates, is that enough? Is it okay that that's what I got? So there has to be some potential for everybody to feel like their work is enhanced, that they can do their work better, that they got some influence or connection or resource out of it. There has to be mutual gain to collaboration. And we believe that there's value in diversity of experience. I mean, this is probably the number one reason people give. And so here's what's interesting about that. Oh. When that diversity shows up, and it will, among the members, we stop valuing the diversity and the collaboration breaks down. So consider that for a moment. In collaboration, we value diversity. We want it, we look for it, we seek it, we praise it, and when it shows up, when the disagreement shows up, collaboration breaks down. And it goes back to what you said earlier. It's so hard to sit and hear people when they don't agree with us. It's so hard. So if we're going to be leading through conflict in collaboration, who do we have to be to create space to hear something we don't agree with? That's a really seminal question here. All right, so real quickly, there are lots of ways to work together. We can coexist. A lot of people coexist. I know you're out there. I know you serve the same kids I do. That's kind of the end of it. We're aware of each other. The next one is we communicate. And this is where a lot of collaborative groups are. We give updates. We share information. The next one, though, might be, if you're coordinating, you might be aware of each other, you might share information, but you might have some joint processes. And the example that I typically use is Department of, what's your child welfare agency called in the Commonwealth?
Office of Children, Youth and Families.
Office of Children, Youth and Families and Juvenile Justice might decide that they need to have a common intake process because they struggle to figure out who has responsibility for a young person sometimes. So law enforcement might have a common intake process with young people, whatever. So you coordinate that joint process. That's coordination. It's still not collaboration. Collaboration is when you're aware of each other, you share information, you have some joint processes, and you co-create policies and procedures, and you share resources, and you share ownership. So the question is not which one of these is right. The question is, who do you choose to be as a group? If you are coordinating and sharing resources or collaborating, are you sharing resources? Are you sharing ownership? Is that where you want to be? So this provides some context for collaboration. And here's sort of an official definition. I'll just leave it up there for you to read because it's really long. But there are some key or key phrases, key parts to these phrases. People work together. I think the one that's most interesting to me is they build an interdependent system. So what does interdependent mean? You need each other, right? Now these slides, are they going to be on the website?
Yes.
Yes. I know I sent them in. Yeah, yes. So I'm watching everybody write furiously.
Yes.
And I don't...
It's on our website, all the resources. We're going green, so.
Yeah. So these should be on, and my email is also up there on the end of it. So if you end up having questions about these slides, you're more than welcome to email me. Yeah.
Can I just say, though, it would be so helpful to have the PowerPoints of the presentations,
Beforehand.
because then you can keep your notes with it. Like, I'll have to go back and figure out how I'm going to join this with this. And I know we're trying to be green, but it affects learning. I really feel strongly about that.
I will share your feedback.
Okay.
Yeah, but we've had the same struggle. I know people like to see things and take notes by them, and yeah, it's tough, especially when you come to a big old definition like this. But really, it's the sharing of resources and responsibilities to jointly plan, implement, and evaluate programs to achieve common goals. If you remember nothing else, this last piece provides the context for leading through conflict. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about conflict. I would like you all to think for a moment about an early conflictual experience, like from your childhood, or the earliest time in your lives that you can remember a conflict occurring, and just think about that for a moment. What we've noticed in this work is that our early experiences with collaboration and conflict really impact the way that we engage conflict and work in collaboration as adults. So I'd like you to think a little bit about that early experience, and then I'm going to ask you a question. What's popping up for you right now? As I asked you to think about that early conflict experience, what's coming up for you right now? What kinds of words are coming up for you?
Peacemaker.
Peacemaker, okay.
Fight.
Sorry?
I had the opposite as fight.
Fight.
Misunderstanding? Avoidance?
Disrespect.
Disappointed.
Silence.
Fear.
Anger.
Retaliation. Scars.
Insecurity.
Regret.
Voiceless.
Yes, ma'am.
Understanding.
Negotiation.
Yes.
Non-existent.
Intimidation.
Okay. I think I saw a hand way in the back.
Admiration.
Admiration? Okay. Anything else?
Jealousy.
So here's what we have so far. Peacemaker, fight, misunderstanding, avoidance, disrespect, disappointed, silence, fear, anger, retaliation, scars, insecurity, regret, voiceless, understanding, negotiation, non-existent, intimidation, admiration, and jealousy. What's the theme here, with a few noted exceptions?
Negative.
Yeah. So it's negative. I asked you to think about something from your earlier lives. So what informs us is typically a negative experience with conflict. Either our family of origin had a way of being around conflict, or we remember a specific conflict that impacts who we are in conflict. A lot of people don't really think about who they choose to be in conflict. They think they would like to be maybe, well, I don't know. I actually don't know what everybody thinks. I know for a long time I didn't think about anything. I just reacted. I just did what came normally, which is fight or flight or freeze. So let's talk a little bit about some, in addition to this, let's look at a common definition of conflict. So Wikipedia would call it a clash of interests. Values, actions, or directions with often sparks a conflict. Conflicts refer to that existence of a clash. Webster's would call it a fight, a battle, or a war. In fact, the military uses that. We have a conflict with another country, right? They call it a competitive or opposing action of incompatibles. I did this for young people, for youth at the institutes one year, and it was so hard to get these young people to see conflict as anything that didn't involve hostility or anger. If there wasn't hostility or there was no anger, there was no conflict. I thought that was interesting and somewhat telling about the way that we think about conflict. So I'm going to offer you how we think about conflict, a definition that we use for conflict. First of all, it's two or more people. Sometimes, I guess you can be in conflict with yourself, but let's just say for the purposes of this definition that it's two or more people. who are interacting, and they perceive, and that word is important, perceive, incompatible differences or threats. In other words, I perceive that you and I don't agree, and you are going to get in my way of achieving what I want. Okay? Incompatible differences, threats, incompatible resources. You have something I want, or you have something I need, or I have something you need and I'm not giving it to you. Incompatible values. Think about that within the context of system of care for a moment. And it's not a matter of you're family driven and you're not. It's a matter of how do we define the value in a way that has some consensus to it, in a way that we share a definition. And I have to tell you, just as an aside, that I find in systems of care, when you assign roles in your collaborative based on the value, you are the youth coordinator, you are the family person, you are the CLC coordinator, what tends to happen sometimes is that people become the voice of the value. And the value doesn't get owned by the rest of the group. And so I'm going to encourage you a little bit here, just it's a little commercial here, to think about assigning roles not so much based just on representation, but on strengths and ideas and experiences. And maybe the person who is the youth-guided person can sponsor the conversation as opposed to define it all the time. Because that incompatible value piece could be the most cited reason for conflict in a system of care collaborative effort. So what happens is, based on that perception of incompatible and the whole list, we behave and respond, right? I perceive an incompatible difference, I perceive a threat, and I'm going to behave and respond to either escalate or de-escalate the conflict. Here's what's interesting, though. You have a choice. You have a choice about how you're going to behave and respond to that perception of incompatible difference. But I don't know about you, but when I perceive an incompatible difference or a threat, and I have some emotion around that, that choice becomes really, really hard. So this is another one of those. I have to go back and decide who I'm going to be, and then I have to make sure I'm acting in alignment with that. So there's actually a really good story about my teenage daughter, who I know was driving her friends based on a picture I saw when she's not supposed to be, because her license says she's not supposed to be doing that. And the picture is of the three of them in the car, but I can't tell if the car is moving. And she said, well, we were just sitting in the car because we were talking. I'm like, do you think I'm stupid? I mean, Erin, all evidence points to the fact that you were breaking the law. And she said, but I wasn't. We were just sitting there talking. You have your seatbelts on. But I promise we were just sitting there talking. I really have no evidence that she was driving other than this picture. So in my mind, I'm thinking, I can choose. And I can either choose to say, I don't trust you, or I'm choosing to trust you even though rational human beings would think otherwise. And I actually did choose that second one. But I'm holding on to that. I am so holding on. I actually taped that picture to her door. What's going on here? So I am holding on to that. But it took me a moment to not feel that internal hot anger that she was doing something she wasn't supposed to do. And I really had to step back and think, all right, what's important here in this situation? And I don't know that I made the right decision. It felt right at the time, but what it did feel is in alignment with my values, in alignment with who I'm choosing to be in relationship with her, in service of our relationship. Okay? Thoughts, questions about this? This is a little bit different way to define conflict. It doesn't have to be a fight, a battle, and it doesn't have to be this. Because if it's this, we're not going to do anything about it, and we have to. It shows up, it should show up. If it doesn't show up, you guys are stagnant. Do you know what I mean? If conflict doesn't show up, it means we're not doing anything innovative or creative. Yeah?
So what made you stop and want to choose option number 2? Because like in the moment.
In the moment.
Conflict, like a lot of us have this knowledge, but it's way pushed back in the middle somewhere, it's lost.
Yeah.
Because whenever we're in the moment of conflict, we react and we don't choose to rationalize.
I know, and it's
What
taken.
made that click for you to choose the other option?
I've been working on this for 20 years. I mean, I've been reading these books, I've been doing this training. It doesn't mean you have to go through that, but I've really been thinking about, because I have to, but also because it's better for my relationships. I mean, I have a husband who thinks very differently about things than I do. And I can either choose to live my life feeling angry a lot, or I can choose to respond in a way that's healthier for both of us. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that choice. And at some point, I decided that there were some moments where I had to step away and not respond and then come back. So I've developed little tricks and tools for myself to manage the emotions so I can get back to being productive.
But the way I hear your story is you were choosing not to enter into the conflict. There was your perception, your daughter's attestation, which were different, and it could have been a conflict, but you chose to value the relationship, reiterate your expectations about safety and welfare of your child, and so on and so forth. But you chose not to enter into the conflict. You know, you could have said, I'm calling your friends, I'm taking
Right.
depositions, whatever.
Right.
But you chose, you know,
Yeah.
but you know, so you had visual information, but you
Yeah.
chose what is usually referred to as conflict avoidance,
Or accommodation. I agree.
but not conflict.
I didn't choose the conflict. I chose who I wanted to be in the moment of confrontation. And who I wanted to be was someone who thought specifically about what I was doing and didn't just react. That was the choice point. And the choice point, you're right, was to not compete, to win. We weren't collaborating on anything at that point. I chose to accommodate her story, knowing that I didn't believe her.
And I like that you did that. That was the choice that achieved your goal
Right.
most effectively. You could have fought about it for weeks.
Yeah, we still might. You never know.
There'll be other things.
I'm sure. There are, actually. Yes, ma'am.
Did you tell her that, though?
I did. I said, Erin, reasonable people would not believe you. But I am telling you right now that in spite of the evidence, I can't prove that the car was moving, and I am choosing to believe you. I'm choosing that you were honest.
See, that would have made me feel so guilty. I would have said, okay, Mom, I'm sorry.
Don't think that I wasn't using that as a strategy. But she really is afraid of getting in trouble, and I know that. So, I mean,
Once you use the word trust,
Yeah.
like I'm choosing to trust you even though I shouldn't,
yeah.
that just kind of puts this guilt on when you're guilty.
I want her to choose who she's going to be too. And I want her to not be honest because she's going to get in trouble, but I want her to choose to be honest because it's the right thing to do, and I expect that of her in our relationship. And so in some ways, I'm modeling that choice of extending trust, even though there's no reason that I should, other than the fact that I can't prove the car was moving. That's the darn lawyer in me. All right, so we're going to move. This definition of conflict is a little bit different. It brings up the fact that we do have emotional reactions to things, and we do have a choice about how we behave and respond. And that's the part that you got to think about for a while. Who do you choose to be, especially if you were taking on the role of leader in conflict? So let's talk a little bit about leadership. We make some assumptions about leaders. First of all, we think you're all leaders in this room. Anybody who's mobilizing people to tackle tough problems is leading. If you are sitting in a collaborative, hoping that people will get inspired to innovate, to tackle tough things, you're leading. It's not just that conferred power thing. Now, some people have that, and we have to acknowledge that. Some people have conferred authority to do stuff. Usually that comes with a fair amount of accountability to get stuff done. So we have to acknowledge that within this context. But really, we're talking about that lower definition. We're all in this to mobilize people to tackle tough problems. And so anybody familiar with Heifetz's work on technical and adaptive challenges? All right, just a moment about this then, because really the work that we're doing in system change is adaptive, and it changes the nature of the way that we engage conflict as leaders. So technical problems are known. I mean, when When I have a technical problem, like with my computer, I call somebody who thinks technically and can fix it. It's a known problem, and hopefully they know the solution. But it doesn't take a lot of conversation about values and thoughts and ideas in order to get there. You either can fix it or you can't. Hopefully you can. Adaptive work, the definition of these problems is not so clear-cut. In fact, we have to work hard and pull on all of our diversity to truly get our arms around the problem. Does anybody in here think that your county, your collaborative system of care table in your county, that you have adequately, clearly, completely understood the problem or the challenges that you face in your community? And do they stay the same? No, they change. People change, resources change. So learning is required in order to understand the problem, and learning is certainly required to understand potential solutions and implement them. So let's just talk a little bit about, I want to just set the stage here. Again, this is a lot of information. We talk a little bit about type 1 situations. The problem is clear, solution's clear. So the primary authority for implementation is the leader, is the authorized leader. So you have a project director, budget, or the report is due to the funder, and they have the authority to write the report and hand it in. Technical challenge, they get to do it, it's done. Type 2, clear problem requires some learning in order to find the solution. You might need a combination of the authorized leader and the community, and it's a combination of a technical problem and an adaptive problem. Type 3, though, is the one that I'm most interested in. So let's use that computer analogy again, although this example is getting a little old. I can't help it, though. Does anybody remember a time when we didn't have computers on our desks? Yeah?
Sad but true.
I know, right? I'm not going to be able to use this for much longer. What happened? How did we get things done when we didn't have computers at our desks? We wrote. There were administrative assistants to help leaders, to help bosses type, take messages. There was no email, so you had to open the mail and clip it to the envelope and make sure that the priority things were on the top. I worked for my dad for a couple summers. It was terrible. So imagine, though, the shift from having an administrative assistant, writing things out longhand, mailing letters, to computers. Is that a technical challenge or an adaptive challenge?
Adaptive.
Why is it adaptive?
Because there's so much learning that goes into how to change over, transition over to the modern way.
And our expectations and values in the workplace shift, don't they? Expectation of who serves who, or how do they get served, of what do I have a right to ask you to do, of what speed are we supposed to be able to work. That's a shift, isn't it? Because technology has made things easier and faster and harder all at the same time. That's an adaptive challenge. So who are we together becomes less about going to get trained to use the computer. That's a technical solution to an adaptive problem. How do we interact with each other and value each other in the workplace? So we are talking about adaptive leaders within the context of collaboration doing work to engage conflictual conversations where there is a perception of incompatibility or threat around resources, needs, and values. So now we've set the stage. All right, so here's the framework. And I think, can I just send these back? Would that be okay? If I just send a couple of these back this way and this way, and if you need more, I've got more. Okay. Okay, so when we talk about leading through conflict, we're talking about 3 roles the leader can choose to take in conflict. The first role is that of participant. So if I am a partner or a participant in conflict, I'm engaging in the conflict with you. Oh, yeah. How many do you, I'll just give you a whole stack. Sure. So if I'm a partner in the conflict, I'm engaging as a participant. I'm not mediating the conflict, I'm not facilitating it. I am a full-on participant. I am affected and impacted, and I am in the conflict. Okay? That sounds pretty normal, right? Yeah? So Aaron and I were participants in that conflict. The second role is the one of facilitator. If I'm a leader in conflict and I'm a facilitator, I've noticed that in my group or in my organization, there are people that are struggling. And I'm not actually in the conflict, but I'm starting to feel the level of distress rising to the point where I feel some responsibility to facilitate engagement in that conflict. Okay? And here's the third one. I'm an arbiter, because quite frankly, sometimes the leader is looked upon as the one who has to make the decision, has to figure out how to move forward. And we struggled with this one a little bit because we actually liked the idea of shared leadership, of helping people come to their own solutions, but we're realistic enough to realize that A, leaders are often looked to as the decision maker, and it's expected that they will make the decisions, and B, sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes it's just important that we move on, and a leader's going to have to impose a decision. All right, so did these roles resonate with you? Is there somebody that's picked a role, that's played one of these roles before in their collaborative group or in their organization that they might want to share with us briefly so we can engage you all in the communication? Does anybody remember recently being a partner or participant in the conflict? This should be the easiest one. Nobody? Really? Nobody's been a participant in conflict either in their collaborative table or in their organization in the last 6 months? Okay, the last week, thank you.
Hate to say it like that, but.
No, it's okay, it's realistic. What about facilitator? This one's a little bit of a tricky one because I hear a lot of leaders say sometimes, oh, they'll work it out. I really need them to work it out. I really don't want to get involved. Has anybody found themselves in a facilitator role as a leader? Yeah? Well,
I'm hired as the systems of care consultant, so by nature I am the facilitator of the county leadership team.
Uh-huh. And so what does it mean for you when conflict emerges in your county leadership team?
Well, one, I've really tried to individually build relationships with every member of the county leadership team so that you're creating a relationship and knowing what it is that people kind of want out of the process. But I also think there's, so we haven't hit like serious conflict, but there's historical conflict, even though there's a very long history of collaboration. And so sometimes it's being able to talk to the other people that actually they do have mutual interest that are related to our systems of care goals. And so being able to share that information across kind of in individual conversations and in the group, being able to identify what are those shared common values and goals and dreams. And we've done that in our process. But I think it takes kind of constant work that's both individually and group-based.
Yeah. Yep. The maintenance of a group is an ongoing challenge, and it sounds like what you're doing is a little developing the relationship so you can do some behind-the-scenes facilitation if you need to, and if it crops up in the whole group, you may need to take that on as a facilitator of that conflict engagement at some point as well. Yep, that's great. Anybody have an example of being a leader in conflict in the arbiter role, where you've just decided that the situation is calling on you to make a decision? Yes, ma'am.
I work with a youth focus group off our county leadership team, and the youth that are on our leadership team bring things back. So it's a fairly large group, and it fluctuates. We have everyone from homeless youth to youth that came out of the system or in college, or it's a big variety. And there is times where everything goes out the window and I have to arbitrate because they will zero in on somebody and, you
Yep.
know, we had a young man who I was doing something that, you know, some of the girls did not like, I would think intentionally, you know, with himself, whatever, he just, and it was escalating and it was in a training, in a larger training. So instead of what we usually do is take it back and table it, I had to kind of
Right.
proceed in our, you know, for his sake, so that he wasn't embarrassed, and then later explain, you know, how that felt, let them explain to each other.
Right.
But it's a tough one when you have such a variety of kids in all different ages. We go from 16 all the way up to 25.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you felt like the arbiter role was at your disposal, because again, especially in sort of facilitative type roles, it's very hard to take that on sometimes. And what I heard all of you say is that whether you're a partner, a facilitator, or an arbiter, you're choosing those roles in service of the work or in service of the group. We know that's not always true, but that's what it sounds like in this group, is that you've chosen those roles in service of the work and in service of the group. So let's talk a little bit about these 4 phases. The first one is preparing to engage. The second one is convening the conversation. The third one is increasing shared understanding. And the fourth one is moving from inquiry to action. So these are 4 phases that we are offering folks as an approach when you find yourself in the role of leader and you've chosen a role based on how you're serving the group and serving the work. There are 4 phases of the actual engagement that you can follow. So we wanted to give folks a template. It doesn't mean you're going to fully engage in each phase every single time, but it gives you a way to think about moving through the conversation. And that's where this matrix comes in, which I'm sure is very hard to see, which is why I made you copies. On the left side, you can see the partner engaging conflict as a participant, facilitator serving others in their engagement, arbiter imposing resolution to the conflict in service of the shared purpose. And then across, preparing to engage, convening the conversation, increasing shared understanding, and from inquiry to action. I'm going to go through those phases a little bit further, but in all of those blocks, so in partner, preparing to engage, there's a thematic statement, clarifying how we want things to be at the end of the conversation. So that's a clarifying statement. And then there are some questions that you can use as a partner preparing to engage to take you through that phase. So this is the tool, it's the framework, it outlines the approach. So let's talk a little bit about preparing to engage. It's very interesting to me that this is the time when we choose who we want to be in collaboration, and yet this is the phase that's often overlooked. I don't know, when you guys know you're going to have a conversation that involves conflict or a challenging conversation, how do you sleep the night before? I don't. Or I wake up very, very early and I start thinking about it and I can't go back to sleep. And so not only am I emotionally charged, I'm tired, which is not a good way to prepare. So we really want people, Greg and I really want people to think about how do they prepare. And there's a big general prepare, who do I choose to be, and there's a specific prepare for this conversation that you're about to have. So the first thing is, who are you in this conflict? Are you the partner, the facilitator, or the arbiter? Sometimes it's not so obvious. Do you have an actual stake in the conflict? Does your behavior impact the escalation or de-escalation of the conflict? It's not, are you affected by the outcome? Because if you're leading, you're going to be affected. It's really, what is your stake in the escalation or de-escalation of the conflict? So which role are you choosing to play? And this will become important as you disclose that in the conversation. So what is your strategic approach? So in the 3-day training, we go through multiple conversation structures. Dialogue, debate, dialectic. We go through the ladder of inference. Some of this may sound familiar to you, but we have lots of ways of unpacking a conversation. And so one of the things we ask people to do as they're preparing is to begin to think about What conversational structure can I anticipate, and how do I choose to be in that conversational structure? Will it look like a narrative? Should I be able to listen to a story differently? Have I already gone up the ladder of inference? So there are lots of observable facts, but I've chosen the ones that have meaning to me, and I believe, or I choose to believe some of them are not, and then I'm acting on them, and those actions and beliefs have now reinforced what data I'm inputting, and it becomes this reflexive loop. So what's my strategic approach for preparing myself to engage in conflict? And part of it is knowing this. Part of it is knowing, you know what, I grew up in a family of origin where my father was a little bit on the combative side, the very loud yelling side. My mother was a little passive aggressive, so while I could hear his voice, I could hear her pots and pans around the kitchen. And I learned very early how to engage in conflict from being in that family. So what does that mean for me as I walk in the table? One of the things I've sort of discovered recently is that I tend to care so much about what people think of me when I'm sitting at the table, and this has a little to do with the Aaron situation, that I'm terrible at punishment. I'm a terrible consequence-giving parent. And I now know why, a little more about why that is. Because I thought a lot about what is it that drove my response to conflict from being a kid. My dad was a PTSD post-Vietnam War vet. And I got along by being really, really nice and not causing any problems. And I know that shows up now when I'm in conflict with anybody in my household, except for my husband, because I've learned how to do that better, much to his dismay. The other thing about preparing is, how are you going to prepare others to participate in the conflict? And I think you talked a little bit about this by developing these relationships with individuals, because you are the facilitator, which makes you in some ways the leader of the group, the facilitative leader, at least the structural leader of this group. Developing relationships and developing expectations about conflict helps people prepare to engage. One of the things that we talk about, actually, when we talk about building collaboration, we have these 7 conversations that we ask people to engage in. The third one is expectations. What do we as a group expect of each other when disagreements arise? Have that conversation. We anticipate that they will arise. We want them to arise. That's why we have all these diverse voices around the table. What do we expect of each other? And how do we hold ourselves accountable when conflict does show up? Has anybody had that conversation in their collaborative group? Expectations around conflict? That's a hard conversation. It's sort of like a prenuptial agreement. You're all really happy that you're getting together and nobody wants to talk about what happens if it doesn't work. That conversation stinks, right? But I would really suggest that it might be one you want to have. So what are the strategies for preparing yourself or preparing others for the conversation to effectively engage in conflict? Okay. We talk about leading at integrity. That's some of the language that we've begun to develop in leading through conflict, leading at integrity. The other language you've heard is leading in service of, engaging, choosing your role in service of the work, in service of the group. That's all language that we've tried to develop as we've developed this training. When you're leading at integrity, we expect that your commitment to be collaborative, your commitment to be the person that you choose to be in conflict should line up with your actions and your speech. That's how you build trust. If you've committed to be a really good listener in conflict, I really want to give space for disagreement, and I want to hear what you have to say, because what you have to say is important. I've committed to that. That's part of our group norms. Okay, so if I've committed to that, what can you expect from me in my actions and my speech? What would you, if I'm committing to be someone who values diversity, who creates space for disagreement, who really wants to build the shared pool of understanding, what do you expect from me?
Respect.
Respect. What does that look like?
Not going to attack.
Okay. So I'm going to speak in a positive way.
Use all that.
We're going to avoid all of this? Okay. Okay. What else does it look like? What else would you expect of me? I'm committing to creating space for disagreement. I'm committing to building a shared pool of learning and knowledge. What are you expecting from me? How do you expect to see me act? What do you expect to hear me say?
I'm going to value your point of view.
I'm going to value your point of view. So I might actually acknowledge it. I might actually, all that restating stuff that they teach you in social work school, that's really helpful here, especially if we're in disagreement. Yeah.
Basically being non-judgmental.
Non-judgmental. What does that look like? If I'm being non-judgmental, what does that look like?
Really just an open listener.
Okay.
Not giving my opinion to anything, but more so just listening to what you're saying.
So if I'm listening with no judgment, I might not come back at you and tell you why you're wrong after you've given me a point of view. I might acknowledge something positively that I learned from you, and then after that I might seek permission to offer or seek space to offer my point of view. That looks different, doesn't it? Okay. It's hard. Suppose I came in here and said to you, I think we should arm all the teachers in our schools. This school shooting stuff is ridiculous, and I think we ought to arm them all. What are you thinking right now? Are you ready to listen to me talk about that?
What if we agree with you?
Are you ready to listen to me talk about that? Are you going to greet me with suspended judgment or to defend your point of view even if you agree?
Suspended judgment.
Okay. What does that look like? It means you might ask me a question or two, right? You might actually want me to enlarge my message a little bit. Yeah, sure.
Don't you have to, when you're in that role, be very cautious of your body language?
Yeah.
Because, that's what I look at when I'm at the tables, and not just over conflict or anything.
Sure.
When you make a statement, you kind of look around and you look at the body language, and you can kind of tell what people are thinking. Just
Sure. There's the actions part.
Oh, okay.
You're absolutely right, because communication is only 7% words.
Right.
The rest of it's facial expression and body language. So there's a couple of my favorites, though. I'm impassionately talking about something that's important to me at the collaborative, and there are people under the table. I hate that. It tells me that's not respect, is it? It's not. It's not respect. Yeah, you're right. And I have a colleague at Georgetown who just could not stop rolling her eyes when somebody would say something. I mean, she was really, really smart, and she really wanted to hear what you had to say, but she had really strong opinions, and boy, did they show up when somebody was talking about something she didn't agree with. I mean, her eyes were in the back of her head, and we kept saying, you have to stop that, because there's nothing that shuts people down than that body language.
Or a deep sigh. I've said to people, do we need to get you some oxygen?
Well, actually, you bring up a good point, because sometimes when the actions or even the words don't seem to align with the commitment, I'm pretty well jumping to the conclusion that you didn't mean your commitment and I'm losing trust. But I may have, if I've committed, though, to this collaborative group, maybe it's incumbent upon me to ask the question, are you okay? Are we still engaged? How do we hold ourselves accountable as a group?
Now, with actions and perception, how does that work? Because sometimes people's body language can be seen
That's right.
different.
Yep, so check it out. When you're getting that gut feeling that somebody's not engaged or that they're feeling a little bit hostile, and this is where having that conversation about expectations up front helps you, because then you've set all these norms. So our norm is that we're all engaged, we're all participating, we're all focused. We've given ourselves permission to hold each other accountable.
It's exactly what I was going to say. Being non-judgmental, you can't judge the body language.
Right.
And you can't judge the texting under the table because you don't know.
That's true.
With a crisis with a staff, and I'm sitting here texting. It's not out of disrespect.
Yep.
I'm dealing with a crisis. Not,
Right.
I don't have the opportunity to tell you that.
That's right.
Being non-judgmental,
That's right.
you have to be able to step back and say, what I see is only a part of the story.
Tip of the iceberg.
There has to be something else underneath that.
Right.
And when I teach a class, I say all the time, what does this generally mean? Well, you may think I'm shut down. It just means my arms are really comfortable sitting on top of my fat belly. So, and I try to tell people, you can try to read body language, but don't assume you know what.
That's exactly right. And so again, setting up norms. When we see something that we're not comfortable with, how do we hold each other accountable? How do we be curious? How do we invite folks in to a conversation with curiosity as opposed to certainty? That's the other concept that we talk a lot about. How are you coming to the table? Are you coming with certainty or are you coming with curiosity? If you're coming with curiosity, you're more likely to suspend judgment. You're more likely to invite people into a conversation with respect that you want to learn. And I take your point about the texting seriously. You're right. I mean, because sometimes I'm responding to one of these kids who's like, can I drive to? No, you may not, type things. And
it's youth culture.
Yep. It is. And is there now therefore become my culture, which is slightly annoying to me.
To sit there in a team meeting and realize that they're talking to each other.
That's right. That's right. In fact, I think that's one of them right now, because I forgot to turn off my phone. In fact, let me turn off my phone, because Erin, I'm not talking to you right now.
We won't judge. It's okay.
No. She can wait. All right. So, when you're thinking about your role as a partner in preparing, this is really important, this partner piece, because if you are coming in as a leader, there may be a perceived power differential. So how are you going to, in your preparation phase, how are you inviting folks into this conversation as equals when there may be a power imbalance? How do you create space for everybody to participate in a conflictual conversation that may feel very dangerous to people when there's a power imbalance? You have to think about that as a leader. In fact, somebody brought that up this morning about inviting family members and youth to the table who may be new. Whether there is or isn't, there could be a perception of a power imbalance. So how do you prepare to have that conversation? As a facilitator, how do you balance your role as a facilitator with your role as a participant when you have a stake in the outcome? If you're facilitating conflict, you cannot say that you don't have an interest in the outcome. These are folks you are leading. You do have an interest. And if you are facilitating their engagement around conflict, how are you going to remain neutral or help that, not neutral because you can't, but how are you going to help them create space for their conversation and make sure they feel supported to have the conversation they need to have? That's tough, that's hard. And then third, let's not forget that making decisions is a risk for leaders. That being the one to make the decision can feel risky. So how do you choose to do that in service of mutual purpose, in service of the work? How are you prepared to do that? All right, so let's talk about phase 2, convening the conversation. Now you've prepared, you've done that by yourself. You've answered some questions. You've thought about who you choose to be. What is this conversation really about? Let's convene it. The objectives in phase 2 are to create a safe space. How many of you grew up feeling like there was safe space to have a challenging conversation around conflict? That's why we hate it. It doesn't feel safe. So your job as the leader is to create a safe space so that people will engage in conflict. And safe space will then in turn increase trust. And if people feel like they can trust a safe space, they will engage. That rings pretty true to most people, right? How do you imagine you might create that safe space? Relationships is one of them, just as a spoiler. Other ways of creating safe space for your...
Establishing ground.
Yeah. And here's where those expectations when you're not in conflict becomes really helpful. If you are creating them because you're in conflict, it takes on a whole different tone. If you've created them way in advance and you can go back to them, they are what they are and not created out of crisis. Okay? So that really gets important. So start with the dialogue about the conversation. Instead of diving right into the conversation, start talking about the conversation. And I think the leader really here has to be very transparent about what their role is. I'm having this conversation with you because you and I are in conflict. And we need to figure out how we're going to move forward. And I recognize that there's a little bit of a power imbalance maybe, but I want to create a space where you and I can talk meaningfully together about what's going on and how we're going to move forward. Can we do that? That's convening the conversation. Because if I don't have that conversation and I am in a leadership role, what's likely to happen? You and I really need to talk about what's going on. We got some stuff to talk about. Where are you going right now in your head? I so don't want to talk to you right now. Right? It feels risky. It doesn't feel safe. That transparency about role and intent and who you choose to be. I want to have a conversation with you because we're struggling, and I value the struggle, but we need to figure out how we're going to get through it together. Can we do that? And what would make this okay for you to participate? It's another good question to ask. They need to feel it. People need to feel like they can contribute. They need to feel like they can trust you and trust the process so they can contribute. Once you talk about how to have the conversation, then you can have the conversation. And this is not linear, by the way, because sometimes you enter into the conflict conversation and at some point you have to step back out because it's starting to feel too risky. It's starting to feel too dangerous. So if you go there, if we're having the conversation and all of a sudden there's emotion starting, it's escalating, and you can tell, you have to step out of the conversation and say, wait a second, this isn't what it was supposed to be about. Let's talk about how we're having the conversation so we can go back and have it. It's a circular process. And as you do that, you build a way of being with each other around conflict. I know there are certain people that I can disagree with, and we can talk until 2 in the morning and disagree and learn from each other and have a great conversation. I know there are other people in my life that I can talk to for about 2 minutes and I'm done because it doesn't feel safe. And I'm not going there. So we'll talk about safe stuff. Talk about the weather, what trips we're going on. But we're not getting into gun control or religion or politics or any of that stuff. Those are conversations that are fun, right though? They enrich us. If we can have them safely. Come on, really?
I mean, I agreed years ago, but now it's...
Does that make you sad?
It does. It does, because I think that a lot of people would meet in the middle if they really listened to each other.
Yeah.
And I think people are now becoming conditioned to just take one side or the other.
You know, and here's what's so interesting about this. So I watch my kids in school who are now in this collaborative learning era. There are all these group projects. They're all supposed to figure out how to work together and agree. Do you think they're learning how to collaborate?
No.
Hell no. Sorry. Heck no. They're not. What are they learning? I know, but I live in Indiana. What are they learning? You know what they're learning? They're learning how to get the smart kids in their groups. Right? I want the smart kids do all the work and gets mad at the other kids. I mean, this is what kids are learning about collaboration. So I agree with you. We have a decrease in civil discourse, a decrease in willingness to listen, and a decrease in group life, even though we think we're increasing it, which is really scary to me, because we just noticed at the very beginning of our time together that we're facing really complex challenges in our communities. And if we can't figure out how to work together and to celebrate diversity and disagreement, we won't solve them. So it's required that we figure this out. And you as leaders are, I think, required to find your courage to go there again. How's that for a challenge at the end of the day on Thursday? Yes, sir.
So is part of the process, nonlinear process, acknowledging and articulating that there is a conflict, what the conflict is.
Sure.
And that there's some desire to resolve the conflict.
Or at least understand it.
Or at least understand.
Yeah. And figure out a way to move forward. I hesitate to use the word resolution. Our field went from conflict resolution to conflict management to conflict engagement. And one of the reasons we got to conflict engagement is because we've recognized that there are some big, hairy, unsolvable problems and conflicts. I mean, there is historic embedded conflict, and to presume that we're going to solve it is ridiculous and demoralizing. So, I mean, climate change, I think, is a really good example of a big, intractable problem right now. Doesn't mean we don't do anything. It means we have to figure out what small victories we can get along the way. But in our field, too, there are still there's some embedded historic conflict.
Well, I think, you know, like every different child serving system has different mandates. Right? They have different funding. They're all there's pressure on everyone to not have out-of-home placement, to have high community-based services. So sometimes I think it's acknowledging that, you know, we do have different mandates, and people are looking for other systems to pick up to support the strain that they're under. And that doesn't, you know, it's a very imperfect system, but the mandates sometimes create the conflict,
Well, and the cultures do too.
and the cultures do too,
'Cause
that's correct.
I was just sitting at a table with mental health, law enforcement, and the Juvenile Justice Center. I mean, and among others. But the difference in perception between law enforcement and mental health right there, it's not, I mean, you just put the word juvenile out there, and on one part you hear treatment, trauma, on the other you hear public nuisance.
That's right.
Treat,
We
detain.
have to protect the community.
Right.
We want to provide
Right.
treatment options.
So our mandates are different, but the lens through which we view the world is different based on our role. And so leading through conflict means having an honest conversation, because quite frankly, coming from that mental health trauma perspective, I get a little frustrated with the gun-toting sheriff sitting next to me. I mean, it's hard sometimes to listen to him talk about all those bad kids that he can't wait to lock up. That's a victory. It's not a victory for me, but it's a different way of thinking. So I need to learn about that. And you know what? I sat down at a breakfast with him, and I was the only female in the room, which never happens in this work. But I was the only female with the sheriff, the chief of police, the prosecutor, the public defender, and the judge. And the sheriff started talking about one of the guys on his force that had actually had a significant trauma as a child, and how that came out in the way that he did his work. And he started, through that narrative, we were able to find some way to talk about what was going on in this community. So, you know, my ladder of inference was, I don't even want to say it because it's not very nice. My ladder of inference was that he was going to hear everything through a law and order lens, and we weren't going to get anywhere. But I listened long enough that I found a reason to make a different assumption, and that was great. So how do we convene the conversation? We identify that something's not right. And we don't have to label it a conflict, but we have to identify something's not right, it's not working. And we're here to figure it out in service of the work, in service of our group, and in service of mutual learning, shared learning.
And I think there are the two parts. I really like the example that my colleague here gave of articulating, you know, we've all got a different mandate, you know, whether
Yep.
you're children, youth, or the parent, you've got a different mandate in life and at the table. And what you just did in your example about the sheriff, though, and just now you repeated it, was you would come together in a civil, safe kind of a way around trying to find a solution.
Mm-hmm.
And what I find, Scott, often with political conversations that I can't comfortably have with friends and family often is, I can say whatever I want about guns in the classroom, because as I talk, it's an intellectual exercise or entertainment.
Right, sure.
I don't have any obligation to try and solve student safety issues when I'm talking to everybody but my brother, who's a police chief. And so I'm then, again, in this intellectual conversation, but aware that for him, it's a mandate.
Right.
For me, it's an interesting conversation.
Sure.
And there's a real difference there. So it's a matter, I think, for me, of acknowledging both, here's the issue, here's the conflict, but we're in the room to address the goal, the mission.
We're in the room to figure it out so we can move forward. No, I agree. And staying away from the language that's polarizing, as I'm watching you do, is important. It's an important part of that. So let's talk a little bit about a safe space where trust can develop. What do we need for a safe space? And I'm going to start rolling through these a little bit faster just in the interest of time. But I think you mentioned it. It's an intentional conversation. What's the intent of the conversation? Is it to build our mutual intellectual interest in the topic? Probably not in this context, but it could be. So holding an intentional conversation about why. Why are you having this conversation? Are you having it because you're stuck and you need to move forward? Are you having it because you have an actual problem to solve? Are you having it because you have resources to allocate? Why are you having the conversation? Do you even choose to still work together? That's a fair conversation to have. So why are you having the conversation? What roles are you playing? I am playing the facilitator. I have gathered you here because the distress in our group is getting challenging, and it's really getting in the way of the work. And so I am choosing to facilitate a conversation in service of you all in conflict and in service of the work. What roles are you going to play? We'll see. We hope that at the beginning of this, you're going to be the decision maker, because this is your conflict and you have to figure out how to move forward. Are you representing others in the conflictual conversation? And if you are, what does that mean? By the way, don't think that just because you start as a participant or a facilitator, you can't move to arbiter. You may have to. Yeah? What are your expectations? So when you're convening the conversation, where is it going to happen? How long do you have? Again, this representative piece is important. So what are the expectations about the conversation? What do we need from each other to make this work? So this is I hate the phrase ground rules, quite frankly, because I think rules make us all want to break them. So I like group norms, our expectations for our conversational expectations. But what do we need from each other to make it work? So confidentiality is a topic that might be discussed here. And I've mediated a lot of conversations between a pair of people within the context of a group in conflict, and confidentiality becomes a very tricky subject there. Because there are people whose work is dependent on knowing about the outcome. So are we talking about confidentiality totally? Are we talking about confidentiality about the conversation but agreeing on what to say? And what happens if it's breached? Which I just was made aware of in a recently mediated conversation. It broke my heart. Because how can I promise confidentiality and not deliver it? It's not dependent completely on me. So it's a conversation that you have to have when convening the conversation to build trust. And that last one then, based on confidentiality, is what do we tell the outside world when we're finished? People want to know. People are very interested, especially when there's big conflict. All eyes are on the conversation. Okay, so special considerations, partners. This dialogue can come up any time when you're a partner in this conversation. It can come up in the hallway. It can come up at lunch when you're all sitting there. It can come up within the context of a group. Are you ready to pull the conversation out of the group context? Can you stay present? Can you stay intentional when the conversation just kind of pops up? That present and intentional part will really help you align with who you choose to be. If you're the facilitator, do people really understand the shared expectations and roles? And if you're the arbiter, this is really key. Just because you make the decision doesn't mean you don't keep people engaged in the outcome. How do you keep, when you're making a decision, this is particularly challenging. How do you keep them engaged? Because once you've made a decision that affects me, my default is to figure out what's wrong with it. And I may not want to do it. I mean, it's human nature. When a decision imposed is often a decision opposed. So if you're going to take on the arbiter role, how do you keep people engaged? How do you help? And sometimes it's this is what I'm going to do, I'd like feedback before I finally make the decision. Sometimes there are ways along the decision-making path to continue to keep people engaged and respect their feedback and that they have a stake in the outcome. All right, let's talk about phase 3, increasing shared understanding. I love this idea of a deeper pool of meaning, shared deeper pool of understanding and meaning. If you've read the book Crucial Conversations, this concept will feel familiar to you. I like this idea that we all contribute to something, but you begin to develop the group's shared pool of understanding. And that's kind of exciting, isn't it? Because the whole group owns it. And then you start sort of thinking together and planning together, and that's when really exciting co-creation can happen to address a complex challenge. So what are the objectives here? This is where dialogue happens. If you're really increasing the shared learning, you're contributing to the shared pool of knowledge, you have to engage in that dialogue that we shy away from at cocktail parties. You have to be willing to have that, I know you may not agree with this, or I'm guessing that you don't agree, but here's what I need to share. And I really want to hear what's going on for you. And if there's a book by William Isaacs called Dialogue, The Art of Thinking Together, and he talks about this concept of generative dialogue. So it's not just I share with you and you share with me and we figure out what we have in common. It's I share with you, which triggers some thinking in you, and you come up with an even different idea, and you put that out there, and then I learn something, and I kind of tweak what I've been thinking about. And all of a sudden, you begin to generate new knowledge based on this conversation. It's called generative dialogue, and have you ever been in a situation where you've learned as you've talked? It's so exciting. Another book that I've read called Reaching Higher Ground will distinguish between common ground groups where we all figure out what we have in common, and higher ground groups where we start, because of our learning and the dialogue that we have, we actually do something that's completely innovative that none of us had thought about before. Again, there's a momentum, there's an exhilaration to that. And yet it's hard for us to get there sometimes because it's work. Dialogue is work. You do get that sort of runner's high when you're in it, though. It's an opportunity to create a shared story. One of the things I love about collaboration, if you're truly collaborating, it really does begin to feel like a we, as opposed to a collection of me's and you's. So you have a mutual statement of issues, you truly shared outcomes, and a very clear understanding of the decisions, the team, and the implementation. Okay. So I love these two slides. This is a little bit about the way we think groups make decisions. So here's the topic, and there's an assumption that these are all ideas that go along in parallel, and they reach a decision point. Does anybody experience that? Is that your experience where you all have parallel thoughts and then at some point you reach a decision and you kind of go along in line with each other? No, that's absolutely not the way it happens. This is the way it happens. Right? And there's a couple things that are really interesting about this. Here's the new topic. Unfortunately, we tend to stay in that little tiny diamond up there called our comfort zone. It's where it's status quo. We're comfortable there. We've done it before. In fact, appreciative inquiry methodology for collaboration will start with what have you done before that's worked? And that's fine as long as you get to the part outside of it. There's your comfort zone. This part right here, where there's all this divergent thinking, is called the grown zone. It's outside of your comfort zone. It's not in sync. But what it ultimately leads to is innovation. An innovative approach to a complex challenge. That's where we want our shared learning to get. We need to get out of our comfort zone. We need to feel discomfort. Get into that grown zone and be willing to stay there. That's the other thing that's really hard. Are you willing to stay with discomfort so you can get to that decision-making point? So, as a partner, how do I balance inquiry and advocacy? When I'm leading in a conflictual situation or conversation where I am participating, how much do I advocate for what I believe and how much do I inquire? Because if I only inquire, what are you going to feel like? Right? You'll feel interrogated, right? So if I only inquire, you'll feel interrogated. If I only advocate, you'll feel shut down. So how do I balance that within that context of increasing mutual understanding or the shared pool of knowledge? How does the facilitator facilitate a conversation in service of adaptive work? So we're talking about new learning. We're talking about a different way of thinking about values. We're talking about adaptive leadership. How do I facilitate that? How do I help people think outside of their comfort zone, stay in that place of distress, especially for those of us who are accommodators and want everybody to like each other, especially for the peacemakers of the group? Can we stay, when facilitating, can we stay with discomfort? Can we hold it for a while? Can we just sit there and let people be angry for a little bit? It's hard, but yeah, we can. Because that's where real growth happens, as long as it doesn't get destructive, and that's our job. And with the arbiter, okay, you've gotten to the point where you're making a decision. Are you still open to input? Are you still open to tweaking your way of thinking? So that's the increasing the pool of shared knowledge. And then we have to do something. A lot of the work that people do out there gets to the point of understanding, but doesn't get to the point of action. We have to do something. So how are we going to do that? First of all, here's some skills and strategies that help us do it. Good leaders in conflict develop the ability to synthesize all of the contributions and give it back in summary. They take a balcony type view of this. Heifetz talks about getting on the balcony and getting on the dance floor and going back and forth. I'm in it, I'm observing it. I'm doing both, I'm moving back and forth, and when I'm on the balcony, I can create a summary. Promoting creative options, being willing to go outside of the comfort zone and ask those big, audacious questions. I'm reading a book right now called The Beautiful Question, and he talks about all of the people that have innovated have asked big, audacious questions, and they usually start with why or what if. So how do you, as a leader, promote that in your group? How do you deal with competing values? And I know that this shows up in system of care. I've done a lot of system of care mediation type work. I know competing values shows up. So how do you facilitate and help people come to some consensus and make really good choices that are in alignment with who they choose to be in service of the work? And then do some reality testing. Get out of your comfort zone, stay in that place of distress, develop creative options, and then bring it down to, okay, what's going to work? And then create a detailed plan for implementation. So here are your special considerations for this role. And most of it has to do, frankly, with trust, I think. Acting in alignment with the decisions, making sure the decisions get implemented, making sure that you communicate about the conversation to those who need to know. Okay. All right, we're coming down to the end. Top 3 things. Choose how you're going to be, then choose what to do in service of. Choose your role as leader. Be intentional about being a partner, a facilitator, or an arbiter. Recognize that you're leading around an adaptive task, and it's complex. It's not going to be resolved in a day, but you can continue to engage the conflict in a way that is productive and moves you forward as a group. So, Collaboration Lab in a nutshell. This is what we've been working on. I'm partnering with Georgetown and with Sound Options Training Group. And we talk about coming into the lab to learn. A lab stands for Learn, Assess, and Build. We want to learn together. We want to be able to assess what's going on when groups are shutting down. And we want to build collaboration in a way that is effective. And these are some of the things we do: multi-party mediation, facilitated dialogue training, and I stepped away too far. And really, this is a culmination of 20 years worth of work for all of us. And it's interesting because we started off really being called to do repair work in Project Launch, in System of Care, in other multi-system groups. We were really called in because groups weren't functioning, and some of them were their funding was in jeopardy. And so we would go through a series of interviews with all the individuals, create a thematic summary, give it back to them, and then have the conversations. And there are 7 conversations that typically show up. So we've tried to create some training and some facilitated work around building collaboration, because, why treat when you can prevent? So building collaboration is really preventative to the repair work. So that's who we are. That's how to contact us if you want, and I totally would love it if you emailed me just with a question or anything, but it's 5 o'clock, and I appreciate your engagement, and I appreciate you being here. So thank you.
Awesome job.
Thank you.